Good afternoon. My name is Ann Billisbach, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series. It's held here at the Museum of Nebraska History on the third Thursday of every month. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about the Society's other programs and services, can be found on our website at www.nebraskahistory.org, and I encourage you to go to that website and see what else we make available to you. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation. They fund the filming of these lectures, and that allows us then to broadcast them on public access television and to reach a much larger audience than we're able to fit into this auditorium on Thursday afternoons. Today's speakers, we have two, are Jim Potter and Edith Robbins, and their topic, and this is a long title, Private August Scherneckau's Civil War, A Soldier's Diary of the 1st Nebraska Volunteer Regiment in Missouri, Arkansas, and Nebraska Territory, 1862 to 1865. Jim Potter is going to speak first, and he'll introduce Edith when she comes up to talk to you. So let me tell you just a little bit about Jim. Jim is Senior Research Historian and Associate Editor with the Nebraska State Historical Society. He has been with the Historical Society for many years, and he served as Associate Director of Research and Publications Division and as the Nebraska State Archivist. He has a longstanding interest in the Civil War, and he's given numerous talks on Nebraska and the Civil War. His publications include an article that he edited for Nebraska History magazine on the Civil War letters of Thomas Edwin Keene, who served in the 1st Nebraska Volunteer Infantry. So without further ado, let me introduce Jim Potter.
Thank you very much, Ann. I'm delighted at the crowd we have today, and it's perfect because it relates well to my topic. If you think in terms of the average Civil War company and a Civil War regiment being about 100 men, and I'm guessing we have about 100 folks in the room, you can pretend like you're amongst your comrades on the battlefield or in camp today, and there's about the right number that we could form a pretty good company here for service. Today we are going to focus on August Scherneckau's diary, which is a remarkable Civil War document that covers his 3 years of service as a private in Company H of the 1st Nebraska Volunteers. While he was in the regiment, it served in Missouri, in Arkansas, and then later coming back home to Nebraska and spent several months in the Platte Valley. And it's the best account by a Nebraska soldier that has yet come to light. Scherneckau was a German immigrant, and he was said to be the only soldier to serve in the 1st Nebraska from Hall County. This project is one that my colleague and I, Edith Robbins, have been working on for about over 4 years. And it really started, I think, with my publication, or at least our collaboration started with my publication of the Thomas Keene letters that Ann mentioned in the introduction. As luck would have it, Keene was in the same company as Scherneckau, and in fact they knew each other very well. And while Keene did not mention Scherneckau in his letters, Scherneckau mentions Keene frequently in his diary. But I edited those letters for publication, and they appeared in the winter 2000 issue of Nebraska History. At that point, and I'd known Edith casually at least for some time, but at that point she contacted me and said, "Hey, I have this diary. I think it's pretty good. Would you like to see some excerpts from it? Maybe it should be published." And there the story begins. I'm not going to go into any more details at this point about that. I'll let Edith tell you. But nonetheless, we started then, and we've kind of gotten to this point and thought it was time to spread the word a little bit. What I'm going to do is just give you a pretty broad overview of the 1st Nebraska Regiment and its Civil War service, and give you some context so that you'll have a better idea when we get to Scherneckau himself what's going on. There will be a little bit of this that has to do with the period of the regiment's history before he joined. He was a recruit to the regiment in 1862, so he missed quite a bit of the early service, including the 1st Nebraska's participation in two of the big battles in the Western Theater. The regiment was formed in June and July of 1861 after President Lincoln called for volunteers, and they assembled at Omaha under the command of Colonel John M. Thayer, who was at that time the territory's leading military man. Nebraska was at that time only a federal territory. It had not yet become a state. It had a population in 1860 of fewer than 30,000 people and probably about 9,000 men of military age. Nevertheless, including the 1st Nebraska, as well as another regiment and scattered units that served in units from other states, Nebraska furnished in excess of 3,000 soldiers to the Union Army during the war. It also furnished a few soldiers to the Confederate Army, although we just have less information. They didn't, of course, go in a unit as the 1st Nebraska did. So what I'm going to talk about mostly here is the story of the 1st Nebraska, because it was really the star of the show in terms of the Civil War as we conceive it, in which we were serving in the South, fighting against Confederates and other forces from guerrillas to bushwhackers, as they called them. This is a photograph, one of the few we have, of an actual soldier from the 1st Nebraska dressed in the uniform that they would have worn early in their service. They were an infantry regiment at that time. Corporal Hutton here is wearing the standard infantry uniform that all of the Nebraska soldiers would have been wearing. This map will give you a pretty good overview of the areas in which the 1st Nebraska served throughout its service in the Civil War. Of course, they started out here in Omaha City, and when they were sent south in 1861, they went down the Missouri. They went to Fort Leavenworth, got a lot of their equipment. Then they returned up to St. Joseph, went across the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad to Hannibal, somewhere along here. Then on a steamboat down to St. Louis. Then in the fall of 1861, the regiment was sent to Pilot Knob, Missouri, and Pilot Knob figures heavily in their history. As long as I have this map, I'll go a little beyond the story and get ahead of myself just a bit. They spent a lot of time in Pilot Knob in that area. They spent part of the winter of 1861-62 up here around Georgetown. In February of the winter of 61-62. In February of 1862, the regiment was called up by General Grant to join his campaign against Fort Donelson and Forts Henry in western Tennessee. So they again went down the river on a steamboat, ended up being involved in those campaigns, which led to the victory, the Union victory at Fort Donelson in February of 1862. Then the regiment was involved in the second day at Shiloh, which is not on this slide either. The Battle of Shiloh was also in western Tennessee, about in there. Then the regiment returned to I think they went to Helena, Arkansas for a while, and ultimately got back up here to Pilot Knob by the fall and winter of 1862, and that's where Scherneckau joined the regiment. Here is a picture of Pilot Knob, Missouri. The mountain is called Pilot Knob. It's near several little towns called Ironton, Arcadia, and so forth. It was an iron-producing area, so that's one reason the town is nearby is called Ironton. I mentioned Fort Donelson, the participation in that battle, which the Nebraska troops played a pretty significant role. Also at Shiloh, this is a map of the battlefield. The Nebraska troops were engaged only on the second day and helped drive the Confederate Army from the field. Well, in October, Scherneckau and the other recruits from Nebraska then joined the regiment at Pilot Knob, just about the time the regiment was going to embark on a major campaign through southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, basically the Ozarks as we think of them today. This particular campaign by the Army of Southeast Missouri was led by General John Davidson, Black Jack as he was later known because he commanded black troops after the Civil War. This was a terribly hard march. Scherneckau just more or less got to the regiment, and then they were launching off on this winter campaign through the mud and the snow of the Ozarks, which started in December and lasted through the end of February. A lot of his diary covers this march. They had trouble keeping up with, the wagons rather, had trouble keeping up with the troops in terms of providing the rations. They often had to cross flooded rivers. There's just a catalog of hardships that they went through in terms of trying to threaten the Confederate control of northern Arkansas. It was really an unsuccessful campaign, but the soldiers had no way to do anything other than obey the orders they got. Scherneckau's, well, the 1st Nebraska generally was issued Sibley tents. I thought I'd show you a picture of Sibley tents. They're kind of the Army's version of an Indian teepee. These were the tents they used pretty much throughout their service in the South. I mentioned the short rations. A lot of times their wagons didn't show up till the next morning, so they went to bed without supper. So finally the officers relented and allowed them to do some foraging off the country. This was very poor country down there as far as agricultural activity, so oftentimes even foraging didn't supply them with very much. Ultimately, though, they finished the campaign. The regiment got back to Pilot Knob in late February of 1863 and were delighted then to be ordered off fairly soon to march over to the Missouri River to Cape Girardeau, which is where they were in garrison for some time. However, and this is another thing that enhances the interest in Scherneckau's diary, shortly after they got to Cape Girardeau, which is south of St. Louis on the Missouri River, shortly afterwards, Scherneckau's Company H was detached and sent up to St. Louis to become provost guards, basically military police. So a lot of his diary has insights into what it was like in St. Louis during this period. After all, St. Louis was the largest city in Missouri. It was the headquarters of the military department of the Missouri, so it was the Union headquarters for a lot of the activity going on in the Trans-Missouri Western Theater. So Scherneckau and his comrades had some delightfully interesting experiences in St. Louis, and they remained there pretty much through mid-June of 1863. At the same time, the regiment left Cape Girardeau. They had fought in a significant little fight there in April of 1863. It's been known as the Battle of Cape Girardeau. It wasn't a very large battle by Eastern Civil War standards. And then the regiment went back to Pilot Knob. It seemed that they were always destined to end up at Pilot Knob in their travels. The regiment was at Pilot Knob when Scherneckau's company rejoined in June of 1863, and immediately the troops from the 1st Nebraska, as well as many of the other troops that were stationed there, were put to work building a fort. It was going to be named after General Davidson, and it was called Fort Davidson. So a lot of the diary has to do with building this basically star-shaped earthwork, which Scherneckau, and maybe Edith will mention this, Scherneckau thought it was kind of a waste of time because here you have the fort, here's a big mountain, here's Pilot Knob Mountain, and basically he said all the enemy has to do is put artillery up on those heights and they can blow the fort into submission. That didn't stop them from building it. They built the fort. The 1st Nebraska then marched away from Pilot Knob, never to return. So they never saw the fact that, well, they probably heard about it, but they weren't there when, in fact, a year later, the Confederates attacked Fort Davidson. There was quite a little battle there in September of '64. The Confederates tried to blow the fort off the face of the earth from the heights, but they didn't have very much artillery, and they decided to try to take the fort by assault, lost a bunch of men. Finally, the outnumbered Yankees pulled out, blew up the powder magazine. But the neat thing about Fort Davidson, it's still there today. You can go see it. It's a Missouri State Park. You can see the actual earthworks that Mr. Scherneckau and his comrades helped to build. Once the regiment was removed from Pilot Knob in late August of 1863, they were dispatched back to St. Louis, the whole regiment. And I threw this slide in just to give you a look. This is not the 1st Nebraska. This happens to be the 17th Illinois. But this is really a good typical look at what a Western regiment like the 1st Nebraska probably looked like about that time. It's about half strength, probably instead of having 1,000 men, which you would start out with, they probably had 300 to 400 men. This would be what you would have seen if you saw the 1st Nebraska pulled up in ranks probably in the summer of 1863. They were constantly losing men through disease, desertion, a few casualties, and they were never able to make up the difference by recruiting either in Nebraska territory or even in Missouri and other places. When they got to St. Louis, Scherneckau's company was sent to guard the Union Iron Works at Carondelet, which was the place where the Union gunboats were being built, the ironclads. So he saw all this going on. He watched them build gunboats. He describes them in great detail in his diary. He also enjoyed the service because they didn't have to do much work. They more or less sat at their camp and looked out over the Navy Yard and made sure nobody tried to burn it down or attack it. He mentioned specific gunboats that he saw being constructed, including this one, the USS Kickapoo. This was a double-turreted monitor, had 2 turrets with 2 guns in each turret. He saw this boat actually being constructed and describes in great detail how many pounds of iron and all of this stuff that went into these things, and which again is something you don't expect necessarily to hear from a foot soldier's diary. About this time, the 1st Nebraska veterans who'd been in for 3 years were given an opportunity to re-enlist. If they re-enlisted, they got to be called veterans, and they also got the prospect of a furlough. Enough of the 1st Nebraska veterans did re-enlist, so while they were in St. Louis, this process was going on in October of 1863. At the same time, orders suddenly came down that the 1st Nebraska Infantry was now going to become the 1st Nebraska Cavalry. So they made them into a cavalry regiment. At a stroke, these foot soldiers had to learn how to ride. They sent them off to get hundreds of horses. Most of them were probably farmers and maybe had ridden a horse, probably knew something about riding a horse, but not with all the equipment. So it's an interesting part of the diary to talk about mounting the 1st Nebraska. Once they got their horses, orders came, you're going to Batesville, Arkansas. This was in November of 1863 that they got those orders. The reason they were going to Batesville, because the regimental commander, by this time Colonel Robert Livingston, had been appointed to be commander of the District of Northeast Arkansas at Batesville. So the regiment took off in mid-December of 1863 and marched overland from Rolla, Missouri to Batesville, where they spent the next 6 months in that area of northeastern Arkansas. Rolla's here. Batesville, I don't know if it shows on them. There it is. They marched from Rolla to Batesville. They got there on about Christmas Day, 1864. For the next 6 months, they stayed in this area of Batesville, Jacksonport, Duval's Bluff, and what they basically did was scout the countryside, chasing irregular forces. Confederate troops and others were just outright guerrillas affiliated with no organized military band. Fought a lot of little skirmishes, wore out all their horses, just about starved to death because the steamboats that brought the supplies couldn't always get up the White River here to deliver the supplies to Batesville. Finally, they pulled out of Batesville, went to Jacksonport, the regiment did, ultimately ended up here at Duval's Bluff. In the meantime, Scherneckau is wounded by friendly fire, so he spends a lot of his time in the Batesville hospital, what they had for a hospital. Then they hauled him to Jacksonport, then they hauled him to Duval's Bluff. In June of 1864, the furlough came through for the veterans. Well, Scherneckau was incapacitated, so they sent him home to Nebraska along with the veterans from the 1st Nebraska for a furlough. While they were all there in August of 1864, guess what? Indian raids along the Platte. So the 1st Nebraska veterans were recalled to Omaha. I think their furlough was somewhat shortchanged. The regiment was then sent out along the Platte. I forgot to mention, well, this is as good a point as any, Lieutenant Colonel William Baumer was also a prominent officer in the 1st Nebraska. He was a German too, so Scherneckau writes a lot about him. And Baumer later would end up commanding the regiment after Livingston was discharged. So the regiment went out along the Platte in the late summer of 1864, and they served there until they were discharged in July of 1866. Scherneckau, being wounded, was in Grand Island recuperating, but by February of 1865, he was well enough to go back to his unit, which at that time was stationed at a little road ranch and complex known as Midway Station, which is near present-day Lexington. They went up and down the trail to Fort Cottonwood, or between Fort Cottonwood and Fort Kearney. Fort Cottonwood later became Fort McPherson. And Scherneckau was a dutiful soldier until he finally was mustered out at the expiration of his 3-year enlistment in October of 1865. So he served his full 3 years, minus the months he was recovering from his wound. The comrades who had enlisted as veterans for another hitch weren't so lucky. They had to stay until July of 1866 when the whole regiment was finally discharged. So we've talked a lot about him. Here he is. We don't have a Civil War era picture of him, but this is, of course, a later life picture. Now I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Edith Robbins, who is from Grand Island. She's worked on this harder than anybody, and she's the one that actually found the diary, called it to my attention. Edith has long been interested in the German story of Grand Island, being a German herself, and has done volunteer work at the Stir Museum. And so it's great to have her with us, and I'm going to let her tell you more about August.
4 years, you said, yeah?
At least
4 years. It's a long journey for me. I had discovered this lengthy diary in Oregon at the State Historical Society there when I was looking for something else. It's always a lucky thing when you find something you didn't expect. And when I read this, it was written in German. When I read it, I thought this is something probably very exciting. I just didn't know too much about it. And I realized very fast that I need professional help with it to interpret this diary. And with the letters Jim had published, I sent him, some excerpts. I translated about 20 pages, I think, and sent them to him. And so we both came to the conclusion it's something very special. Jim put it in chapters and added about 400 footnotes to the whole thing to really get an idea, an explanation for many things. And wonderful things, he answered all my many questions I had. So why it is so important maybe to translate this German diary, since literature on the Civil War is already so substantial. I think a German immigrant new to this country may comment on situations which would be ordinary to an American soldier and therefore probably not mentioned. The writer, as you know, is August Scherneckau. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that he was very well educated. His German is impeccable. His daily notes are well written, and they testify to an alert and sensitive observer. Scherneckau was born on Christmas Day in 1837, just short a few days of my birthday, 100 years later. So I remember this well. He was born in Rendsburg in Holstein in Germany into a well-to-do family. He came to Davenport in 1857, stayed there for a while, for 1 year, and came then to that new settlement, Grand Island, in 1858. And he was, as you mentioned, the only volunteer, well educated and so on. But what motivated a young man of 25 to having in Grand Island, having a good place of land, he's sitting there, have a great future ahead. So what would motivate a man like this to volunteer? In the 1848 revolution in Germany was in general an uprising in order to unite Germany. Unfortunately, this uprising failed, and historians have suggested that the idea of freedom and unity in Germany had been now the motivation for so many German men to take part in the Civil War on the Union side. Between 1845 and 1860, the flow of German immigrants was especially strong and reaching a high point in 1855. According to a German publication, there were about 2 million soldiers serving in the north on the Union side, and of these were 260,000 German-born soldiers, and about 300,000 were first-generation Germans. That means both parents were born in Germany, but the young man was born here. So it's really a large number of Germans participating in this one. So it is no surprise that the settlers in Grand Island were very eager to support this young man to go to war. In order to let his friends and his family in the settlement share his war adventures, he faithfully mailed them letters and notes and diary entries. Later he would transcribe these communications to produce the diary we have today, and I'm glad he typed that in 1918, because I'm glad I didn't have to read the long. So translating a document like this always brings some problems. As a translator, one tries to be neutral, one tries to be the messenger. But a translator is limited to the understanding of the English language. Split infinitives are a trap for German speakers, by the way. And to the knowledge of the subject you have to deal with. So language is such a precious but frail thing, and especially to an immigrant like I am, who has to live in another language and is on the brink of losing its own. Another difficulty in this case had to be dealt with, and that was the diary was written in the 1860s. Both languages, English and German, have evolved in the meantime. So to find the correct word in English for a German word used probably only in the 19th century, to try to keep this authentic flavor and still make it accessible for today's reader, this is a challenge. As I said before, Scherneckau's German is impeccable. It would be unfair to the writer to translate an excellent German into a clumsy English, so I tried. With a little time I have I will give you a few excerpts from his diary so that you get an idea what his day-to-day life was. In food, for example, that despite the technology in transportation and communication, the process of food preparation was probably not that much advanced. The Civil War soldier probably ate the same food as his fellow in the Revolutionary War had eaten. It was pork and salt brine and hardtack. That was generally the stable diet for them. The supply of food was frequently critical, as you mentioned, in these long marches they had to take. The supply didn't arrive. Here on Monday, February 9th in 1863, Scherneckau is marching with the army in southeastern Missouri, and it's winter, remember that. And he writes, "Coffee, mush, and fresh beef were now our only food, and except for the meat ration, it was so little that I could not adequately eat my fill even once. There was something available only early in the morning and then again late in the evening, since during the whole day we had to march strenuously. A pig killed now and then gave us little variety and made the ration somewhat larger. Since the officers could not keep their word to provide the soldiers with food, nothing was said when the hungry men took whatever was edible from the houses along the road. And it did not end there. The residents were completely plundered, often from their belongings, which were of no use to them. They were destroyed by the marauders. Unfortunately, there are only too many of such men in our union, in our group." Another entry is from Monday, May 16th, 1864, and he is by that time wounded and is in Jacksonport in Arkansas in the hospital. The Union at that time experimented with processed food, and they were distributing condensed milk and desiccated vegetables. I had to look that up. These are dried vegetables. Easy transportation and easy to prepare in the field. That was the idea about it. In general, the soldier did not like the taste of all this, and he called it condemned milk and desiccated vegetables. I somehow can feel for them because I went through the airlift in West Berlin And we had everything dried, from milk to powder to vegetables, and the vegetables I never really liked. So he writes on Monday, May 16th, 1864, "Our food is still not much. Since we are here, we are receiving something new in beverages, ready-made coffee. That's coffee, sugar, and milk all together in a can, ready to use, just to be poured into hot water. It is a fair drink, of course, weak in coffee, and tastes more like oil than milk. This morning we had cornbread for breakfast, since the bakery had not been prepared to deliver the required wheat flour bread. At lunch we had salted fish, mackerels, I believe, and dried potatoes, as well as a very good pea soup. The first decent food we have had since we are here." Now, remember, he is sick. He is in a hospital. Alcohol was a big problem because, water was always was sometimes not very good, and you didn't drink water if it was not boiled or so on, and alcohol was always a solution for many things. So you have a lot of drunks. I think alcohol was a problem. He writes on Wednesday, July 8th, 1863, "Very warm weather today. After I was relieved, I was lying on my bed in the tent while the remaining men worked on the fort." This is now the Fort Davidson we talk about. "When relieved from guard duty, we have no more work to do that day. Suddenly, a bugler in the fort blew assembly. All men were soon gathered there. After silence was re-established and the assembly came to order, and our Colonel Livingston stepped up. At first, he informed us of all kinds of good news. Vicksburg had surrendered, our troops had driven back an attack on Helena, and they were also victorious in Pennsylvania. As a result of all these good news, he gave us a holiday, then closed the meeting amid 1,000 shouts, 'Hooray!' Just as on the 4th of July, each company received a half barrel of beer. Drunks and fights were the result. Unfortunately, our company distinguished itself in this especially. Due to drunkenness, bloody heads were there among the best of friends. It is really brutal how these men beat up each other. Also, the officers were soon drunk, and many of them beastly dead drunk. Even the officer du jour could barely stand on his legs. So that is one holiday. He mentions blacks. There is a very dramatic, he witnessed a very dramatic incident in St. Louis where people tried to kidnap a black man. And he is already in his quarters, and they hear the soldiers hear the shouting for help. And so he runs out with a bayonet fixed on his gun, and we soon saw the cause for the mob. 2 men were carrying off a Negro by force. A carriage was standing at the corner of the block, apparently to pick up him and his persecutors, but it drove off with high speed when they saw that we had stopped the kidnappers. It was clear, simple kidnapping, as unfortunately it is still carried out too often. The poor blacks know that the Union soldiers are mostly friends and almost always help us when they are in trouble. Therefore, the poor guy was delighted and shouted when he saw our bayonets flashing about him, since by now at least a dozen of our men were on the spot. "Massa, now I'm all right. I got my papers. These men have no rights to take me." The man who had arrested him now identified himself as a deputy constable of some county in the interior of Missouri. He had a warrant to arrest and return 5 or 6 Negroes who had run away from their owners. However, he had no right to detain 3 Negroes here who did not match the description which had been given in the arrest warrant. So that's one. It is a very long description there. In 1862, the Union Army started to recruit blacks. Some soldiers opposed arming blacks because they simply did not believe blacks could possibly be good soldiers. Fighting under white officers, since blacks were not allowed either regimental or company commands, black soldiers numbered just under 179,000, about a tenth of the total Union military force. On Wednesday, November 12, 1864, in St. Louis, he writes, "The buildings on Main Street containing quartermaster and commissary stores are all guarded by Negro soldiers, young, strong men. The uniform looks better on many of them than on some of the white soldiers in our regiment. We talked about the guerrilla warfare, and he is in northeastern Arkansas in the mountains, and he and his comrades have sighted 2 guerrillas. On January 31st, 1864, there was a danger that both men running away would be soon hidden by cedar brush. We fired on them and forced at least one of them to several involuntary jumps, grabbing his head with both hands. The bushes, however, took him out of our sight, and we saw none of them again. This was the first human being I had shot, very calmly and quite deliberately, and who apparently also had been hit. So he's very serious about what he was doing there. As you heard later, he was serving on the plains, and unfortunately, the time he is wounded, we don't have the election of 1864, President Lincoln. It would have been fun to read that. He is about 10 miles south of Lexington and 35 miles west of Fort Kearny, I think. Monday, April 10th, 1865. It is snowing just as hard as yesterday. The snow is close to 6-inch deep, yet it is warm. This noon, the officer of the day came with a telegram signed by Stanton and Abraham Lincoln, which announced the surrender of Lee and his army. Our regimental band, in spite of the bad weather, played several patriotic melodies. There was general joy. This evening, already both of our prisoners who had been brought here were set free and slept with us in the quarters of the band. The wind was still easterly, and it looks like more snow now. And on Sunday, April 16th, only a few days later, he writes, warm weather, nice weather. Company inspection as usual. Yesterday evening, we received from one of the passengers on the stagecoach the first report of the assassination of the president. It was very depressing. Big debates about the value of Lincoln, and several put him even higher than Washington. So I will stop here with the excerpts, but I am convinced that there are still a number of Civil War documents in the German language, because the number of German soldiers serving there was pretty large. And these documents, I think, deserve more attention. And I hope that the translation of this diary will lead to more discussion on the participation of the German immigrants in the Civil War.
We seem to have a fair amount of time left, and if you'd like to know more about the diary, more about anything relating to Civil War in Nebraska, we'll try to help you.
Was Carl Schurz or any other German mentioned in the politics in America?
No, was not mentioned here. He was in a unit which was completely American. He learned English quite fast and well, I think, but he is not mentioning.
No major figure in American politics like that.
He does not mention Carl Schurz.
And a follow-up to Jim, I remember when you presented to our Civil War Roundtable the Keene diary and how there was a fight with the 58th Ohio, and they killed 6 men in the 58th Ohio. Is there any similar dramatic confrontation like that?
Nothing quite like that, and of course Scherneckau was not in the regiment at the time that episode took place, I think shortly after the Battle of Shiloh, but there's a lot of references to beating each other up in a drunken stupor. I mean, one of the things he catalogs is as time goes on, he becomes less, I guess you could say, illusioned as opposed to disillusioned,
Yeah.
but he becomes, he looks a little askance at many of his comrades, having lived with them for several years, and at one point he said something about how he's really disappointed in most of the men. Now bear in mind, he was from his homeland's rather elite class. He was certainly much better educated, I'm sure, than most of the men, but he starts talking about the quote, noble 1st Nebraska Volunteers as a bunch of braggarts, drunkards, and sycophants. They didn't really meet his standards in many respects. Some of them did, and he identifies people that he really valued highly. He had one really close friend who was an American by the name of Foster, I think.
And Keene.
He also, of course, he's no prude. I mean, he drinks beer. He drinks wine. A lot of times when they go through little German areas, he finds a way to get a nice little glass or two of wine. But he's clearly not a drunkard like a lot of these guys. And as best we can tell from what he wrote, he did not himself get into any of these fights. He also talks about some of the things that he observed in St. Louis. One of the teamsters from the 1st Nebraska was killed in a house of ill fame. Scherneckau describes the funeral, the march off to the cemetery. The chaplain gave a little homily about too bad that this young man lost his life this way, and the country thereby lost his services when he was in a place he had no business being. Typical of soldiers, I'm sure, in all wars. And that's what his company was doing in St. Louis for that period of time, was going through the gambling dens, going through the whorehouses, finding soldiers without passes and arresting them if they could. But most of the time he said they got away because the streets were like a sort of a rabbit warren of alleys and little passageways, and they almost never caught anybody unless they were so drunk they couldn't walk, or they sort of wanted to be caught for some reason. So, yes?
You said he had a close friend who was an American. Is there any indication as to how well he spoke English?
I think didn't he run the books in when he was working on the planes?
Well, he obviously spoke English very well by the time he got out, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But even at the beginning, when he was enlisted in the fall of 1862, they spent several weeks in Nebraska City, which was the recruiting depot, and he was probably the only German in that group of 20 or 30 recruits. So he's writing in German, but he's salting English words throughout the diary regardless. But I think by just the fact that he was outnumbered, and at one point he says, even before he joined the regiment, he said, I really like the guys I'm with, meaning the recruits. I'm going to stick with them if I can because they're good guys, at least he thought so at that time. And he said, I'll get a better chance to perfect my English. I'm used to talking with them. And then at one other point, after he'd been in for a couple of years or a year, there was one company of the 1st Nebraska that was predominantly German-speaking. They were enlisted from both Omaha and St. Joseph, Missouri. Scherneckau goes to visit him, and he puts in his diary, he said, I started talking in German to him, and I got kind of tangled up because I was throwing in so many English words. Finally, when they got back to Nebraska and he was recovered and went to his company out on the plains, they made him the company clerk. They wouldn't have done that if he wasn't very fluent in English, because company clerks had to produce tons of written documents and orders to keep the military bureaucracy going. Let's start there, and then we'll go there.
Yeah, over there.
What did he do after the war? I see this picture.
Okay.
You tell that story.
That picture was. Oh, I'm sorry. I have to go here.
Can you say it?
Well, he went later to Oregon. He wanted to settle. He somehow left Grand Island and went west because Oregon was developing the way Nebraska was developing. And he settled there for a while. He went he was at several places. Interesting to me is how he kept that diary, obviously. He had collected all these letters and notes from his friends in Grand Island and had taken them with him. He was married, got a wife from Germany in the time before he went, and he went to Oregon, and kept these things. And when his wife died in 1908, he decided, at that time his sister was living with him, he decided that he would like to go one more time to Germany. He was an old man by that time. And he was caught in World War I. He couldn't come back. There was a trip. But since he dates the end of the diary, he dates a certain date, the war wasn't over yet. So I assume that he must have typed it over there. I cannot figure this otherwise, And then it was somehow in family papers, it was handed to the Oregon State Historical Society years ago.
We speculate on how we think Oregon doesn't really, they know who donated it to them back the typescript diary back
Yeah.
in 1984, but they don't have a good story as to how that person got it. But it was somebody descended from another German who lived in the same town. Astoria is where Scherneckau ended up,
Yeah.
and died. He didn't die in Astoria, but he's buried there. So we speculate a little bit in our introduction that another German in Astoria who got to know Scherneckau, and since Scherneckau and his wife had no children, he had this diary, this typescript, and he entrusted it to this guy, who then passed it down, and then that went into the.
I was
Oregon.
just lucky to get it. That's
Yeah.
all.
We had a question back there.
My question was the same as hers.
Okay.
How did it end?
How did it end up in Oregon?
Yeah, yeah. I think there was
Yes, back
somebody there.
there.
Got a question on one of the people in the regiment. Does he make any mention of Harrison Johnson?
Yes, he does. For those of you who don't know, Harrison Johnson was a black man that enlisted in the regiment when they were in Arkansas. Even though they didn't give blacks full rights as soldiers, they were carried on the regimental rosters as undercooks. Many of them didn't last with the regiment too long. Some of them deserted. But Harrison Johnson was actually attached to Company H. He stayed with the regiment when it came back to Nebraska. Scherneckau mentions him a couple of times. Once when they were, I think, in St. Louis, and he talks about Harrison took care of my things. Johnson then gets mentioned, and I guess Scherneckau doesn't mention him, but after Scherneckau was discharged, Johnson was still with his company when they sent him out to Lodgepole Creek out by north of Sydney, that part of the trail, and there was a little skirmish out there in which the company commander mentions that our Negro Johnson behaved very well, fired 2 shots during this little battle. And then, of course, I think many of you may know that Johnson stayed in Nebraska after the war, became a janitor, I think, at the state capitol, and he's buried out here at Wyuka in the Veterans Circle. So yes, he's mentioned a couple of times. That's a long-winded answer to a short question. Did we have?
Yes.
Oh,
You had mentioned that members of the 1st Nebraska Regiment had the opportunity to re-enlist, and then they would be considered veterans.
yes.
Okay, questions. Why wouldn't they be considered veterans before that point? And then what was the incentive? What would they get as a result of that?
I suppose in the general sense, anybody that served in the war for a period of time would be considered veterans. But what this meant was they had the right to put veteran in the name of their regiment. Instead of being the 1st Nebraska Volunteers, if enough men re-enlisted to keep the regiment viable, they would then be able to call themselves the 1st Nebraska Veteran Volunteers. As to the reason this was important, most of the 3-year enlistments were starting to expire certainly in 1863 on into 1864. The Union Army saw a real problem looming if all of these guys went home. So they tried to make incentives to get these guys to re-enlist, the ones that had served. One of them was the name thing. The second was they got a bounty if they re-enlisted. The third thing was they got this furlough. If I think 3/4 of maybe it was done by company, I can't remember, but a certain number of each company re-enlisted, or a certain number of the regiment re-enlisted, then they got the status of veteran and they got the furlough. So all of those were designed to keep the Union Army from falling apart just at the critical point of the war. If nothing else, Ron.
Let me put it in context, if I can again, that his company was picked to be the law enforcement arm in St. Louis, and yet he describes them as quite drunk. That means the rest of the 1st Nebraska were even more drunk?
Well, actually, when he's describing these drunken brawls, this is not when he is with the rest of the regiment. When he describes these episodes that Edith read about, like July 4th or July, that was back after he and his company had rejoined the larger group. I'm not saying that some of his comrades in his company that were pulling military police duty in St. Louis didn't do that, but he's more concerned there about catching all of the other drunks out there from other units. But that's the best I can tell you.
Do you think the political aspect was sterilized out of this, the typed version from his diary? Do you have the original diary?
No.
We don't have.
No, but I think he was quite.
Filtered through.
I think it was quite faithful.
I'm going
What he
on my
do?
innate sense of what seems right, and I don't feel like he did hardly any changing to what he had written originally.
He wrote on the end of it that he faithfully transcribed it on such and so date.
If you read it, I think you'll get the same sense that he didn't sanitize it.
No.
He made a conscious effort to retype what he wrote at the time, and so that's why this is such good stuff in my opinion, because even we had the best of both worlds. We have what amounts to the actual document in a way, the field document, but he retyped it for Edith so she didn't have to read his handwriting. Yes.
There were a lot of Indian uprisings in 1864, and I assume that's why they stationed them at Fort Kearney. Did he actually get involved in any of the patrols, or?
He went on a few patrols, but in that kind of warfare, it was almost in a way similar to what he had been doing, or the regiment had been doing in Missouri and Arkansas, trying to catch a very elusive foe who would never stand up in a fight. But he went on a few patrols. He didn't. I don't think he fired a shot at an Indian while he was out on the trail. He got to I think it was Dan Smith's ranch, which was the next station west of Midway, just after a little group of Indians had raided off some horses, killed one soldier from another company, and one of the acquaintances that he has in the company, I think also in the same company, I don't know why everything comes from this one company, Francis Lonis, was the only Nebraska soldier to receive the Medal of Honor, from the only first Nebraska soldier to receive it, and it was this little skirmish that Scherneckau got in on the tail end of when that occurred. But he mostly
Was protecting. He was protecting people from going from fort to fort. He would go as a guard.
mostly what they did was stagecoach escort.
Yeah.
4 guys followed the stage up to the next station, then they waited for the other
Returning.
direction stage, and they rode back to their place. It was just stagecoach escort was mostly what they did.
Will this diary be published?
We are now in the process of seeking a publisher. We've got it being looked at, and we certainly are going to publish it one way or the other.
With the lack of any general political commentary, is there any statement, or do you get a sense of why did he join up? Why did he go to the party?
I think I mentioned this on the beginning, that I think he was brought up in the spirit of the 1848 revolution, and many of the settlers in Grand Island were soldiers in that revolution in Germany, and that was a revolution to unite Germany. Germany at the time was kind of a patchwork quilt of different duchies and so on, and I think the spirit was very much in the settlement of Grand Island. There were people who were, his uncle, who was in Grand Island, was one of the famous 48ers, they're called.
And I should add that I didn't mean to give the impression there isn't any political commentary. He talks about emancipation. He liked it. He said, good idea. He castigates some of his comrades who are lukewarm to the idea. So there is political commentary. In that regard, he also is free to criticize the generals in some cases, because he's sending this stuff home to Grand Island. And as you probably know, there was no such thing as censorship of Civil War soldiers' writing, so that's one reason it's so great. It's pretty candid a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
Let's try over here.
Did he belong to any of the German societies like the Turners?
Okay, in Grand Island this didn't exist at that time. It was a new settlement with, in 1860 we had 116 people and just a few Germans. This came a little later.
And we had there.
He was writing to his uncle then in Grand Island?
He had friends there, he had his uncle there, and you must remember that most of the people who settled in Grand Island came from Schleswig-Holstein. Many came together on the boat, many knew each other from home. It was one of these pull-push situations where immigrants come over.
Who was the uncle?
The uncle was Frederick Hedde. Yeah, he became famous for the territorial politics here for Grand Island. He was sent to Omaha to be, and he was also in 1870-71. He was the state immigration commissioner in Germany. He went back to Germany to get immigrants to Nebraska. Mm-hmm.
Ron?
Did you ever have, reading the diary, that aha moment says, yes, this is a German who wrote this, but my German grandfather, he really would cook apricots up, and that was something that preserved
Well,
vitamins during the
yes,
diary.
he does make, he talks about, for example, he finds green apples. I assume these were Granny Smith apples, but he said he had never seen this. He talks about food which is different. And this is what I think is so interesting, because he sees things which an American soldier would never mention in his diary.
He'd never eaten hominy.
He had never eaten, yes.
What I like, being a black powder person, is when they were at Carondelet guarding the Navy Yard, they had quite a bit of free time, and so they'd go across to the Illinois shore across the Mississippi and shoot squirrels with their muskets.
Mm-hmm.
He said when a 58 caliber mini ball hits a squirrel's head, it removes it entirely. Well, we're getting about to the end of our hour, so if there are no more questions, I want to thank you all for coming. This is a great crowd, and I can't tell you when the book will be out, but one way or the other, it will be.
We're working on it.
We've done too much work to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just right.